Well, good morning. Good morning. It is good to see you. Thanks for being here on this Saturday morning. We said we are going to start at 9, so it's 9:01. Oh, we already broke our promise. We had donuts. We didn't. Yeah, that's extra. So thanks for being here. My name's Seth. If you don't know me, I'm one of the pastors here at Bethel, and it's just good to be with you. And I'm excited for this whole weekend. A year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to go out to Gettysburg with Jay and Lori and Pastor Matt, and we just tramped all over the Gettysburg battlefield, and it was fantastic. I was telling someone back there, I've been a Civil War buff my whole life since I was about 10. Long story. And you guys know, if you know me, I'm into photography. So, of course, I had to take my camera. I took my drone, which you can't fly on the Gettysburg battlefield, but they never said anything about the parking lot of your hotel. So there may be a drone shot that I own of the Gettysburg battlefield from just straight down from our place. But I also took my rangefinder because I like to hunt. So I'm out there with my camera. I've got notes I'm scribbling. I've got my rangefinder. I'm ranging everything. I want to know how far the Emmitsburg Road is from like the angle and all this stuff. And older gentleman, he comes up to me at one point. He says, "You're really into this, aren't you?" And I thought, maybe I need to tone it down just a little bit. But it was super fun. It was been really impactful for me. Just as I think about leadership and leading in the church and in other places, Jay has been doing this a long, long time. 25 years, right? 25 years on the Gettysburg battlefield. And he has this is a unique opportunity that we have because for 25 years, when people would invite him to come to like churches or events like this, he would say, "No, I want you to come to the battlefield and walk it with me and like see." And so he and Lori have handed that ministry off to a new team. And so when we came knocking, he was willing to say yes to come. So we're going to be very blessed this morning. So I'd love to invite Jay up here this morning. This is Jay Lorenzen. I'll say a word of prayer here, and I'll hand it off to him. Father, we just thank you for this morning. Thank you for Jay and Lori and their service. Thank you for this time and everyone who's here. We just ask that it would be profitable, enjoyable, and Lord, that you would get the glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning. A little cool out there this morning, but we're from Colorado, so it actually feels pretty good. But anyway, what a privilege to be here. When the movie came out, the Gettysburg movie came out in 1996, Lori and I were on a weekend, kind of a planning weekend, because I was just getting ready to retire from the Air Force after 20 years, and we're trying to discern what maybe God wanted us for our next journey. And we went, and just happened near the hotel was this new movie out, Gettysburg movie, the Turner movie Gettysburg. And so we went, and it happened to be, you don't see these very often now, there was a 4-hour movie. So it had an intermission. I don't know, you've been to many lately for sure that have intermissions in them. But at the end of the movie, like Seth, I had taught political science at the Air Force Academy. I had gone to school in Europe for a while. I was interested in European politics. But sitting there and watching this movie, and it just kind of, something happened. And I was just reading the credits at the end, and it says, based on a book called Killer Angels. And I'd vaguely heard about that book, Killer Angels, because in 1973, it won the Pulitzer Prize, but it was right at the end of Vietnam. So people weren't interested in military history at that particular point in America. And then about 20 years later, when the movie was made, people began to rediscover this beautiful book by Michael Shara. And now it's standard reading material in all the war colleges of all our services because of its insight to leadership and to what enables men to fight in very difficult circumstances. And after watching the movie and then walking next door to Barnes & Noble, getting the book and reading it, I began to go to the Pentagon. And I'd have some time out of the Pentagon, and I would rent a car and I drive up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just north, 8 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, within an hour of the Pentagon, basically, if the traffic isn't bad. You can get to Gettysburg, and I began to jog around the battlefield, and it constantly struck me, because I was a little bit familiar with the 3 days of the battle, July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd, 1863, a Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the bloodiest days in American history. 51,000 casualties in a 6,000 acres that make up the battlefield that surrounds this little county seat of Adams County, this little town of Gettysburg. There were only 4,000 people who lived there, and when on July 1st, as the armies converged on this little town, 160,000 men showed up and contended against each other. 90,000 men from the Union, 70,000 men from the South. The Union commander was a guy by the name of George Gordon Meade, who had just assumed command 3 days earlier. In command of the Southern forces, the Army of Northern Virginia, was Robert E. Lee, and he had been winning a series of victories at Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, and while U.S. Grant was winning out west, a series of Union victories out east in the most important armies, the armies closest to Washington, D.C., Robert E. Lee was winning victory after victory. And people in the North were wondering, can anybody stop Robert E. Lee and the men from the South? And Robert E. Lee, in order to pull Union attention away from Vicksburg, which is about to fall, on the Mississippi, and is about to fall, he invades the North. And he takes 70,000 men north from Virginia through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, and they are beginning to converge on this little town of Gettysburg. And fortunately for the Union, in command of 2,500 to 2,900 cavalry was this guy right here, John Buford. And over the years of going to Gettysburg, and I began to think, and jogging around the battlefield, and my heart is broken as I imagined what happened. The question that struck me all the time, and it still strikes me every time I go, is what enabled people to do this? What enabled men to make the 15th Alabama, for example, who, if you've heard of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who attacked the 20th Maine on Little Round Top. 5 times they charged up that hill after marching 25 miles. And we've all seen maybe scenes, or you've heard of the Pickett Charge or the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble Charge, where 12,500 men march across these wide open farm fields. 120 cannon artillery are aimed, and that's my wife. She's making some noise to see if I'll get distracted. She's letting me know where she is so she can keep the time schedule so we don't keep you, because like Seth, I could talk about Gettysburg forever and ever, anyway, I forgot where I was in the story. But the question is, what enabled men to fight like this? Or they were only men at that time, what enabled people to fight like this, to cross these fields? And I wondered, is it possible that could be true of the people who serve? I was serving with the military ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ at the time, so we were ministering to military around the country, and wondered, I'm thinking to myself, could it be that people would do that today? What was the secret behind the sacrifices, the supreme sacrifices that these men made those 3 days on both sides? Is there a secret? And I began to ask the question, what is it that enabled men to do this? And the more I read about battlefield leadership, and particularly the 3 days at Gettysburg, the more I began to understand it came down to 2 things. It came down to leadership, you know, that the best performing units at Gettysburg were the best led units. In fact, Robert E. Lee says en route to Gettysburg to one of his division commanders, a guy by the name of John Bell Hood, he told him, "My men can do anything if properly led." He says, that's the problem, is getting good commanders. And so one of the lessons that initially struck me and has continued to strike me over the last 25 years is that the leadership is the critical variable. It's a critical variable in your family. It's a critical variable in your business. It's a critical variable in church leadership. It's the critical variable. But that leadership, those principles of leadership, have to be coupled with the second principle. And this seems, in many ways, counterintuitive. And that second principle is love. And it's hard to imagine this, but G.K. Chesterton, that great Catholic philosopher, says the true soldier does not fight because he hates what is in front of him. He fights because he loves who's next to him or who's behind him. And the more I read about the sacrifices in both the North and the South, not only were the best units those who were well led, but those who pursued their cause in a company of friends. And Jesus says the same thing. No greater love than this, than a man should give his life for his friends. So when it comes to leadership, it comes to understanding the battle. Part of it, basically, as I begin to process these things, and I begin to think about ministry leadership or business leadership or leadership within the family, I begin to ask myself, could it be that what it takes to lead well on the physical battlefield are the same things it takes to lead well in every other arena in which we fight? And so I began to try to draw out some principles and, of battlefield leadership and try to make application to the places where we lead. Okay? And one of the first principles that comes out, not only in the book, but when you visit Gettysburg, there's a monument to this guy, John Buford. And this was his staff that he led into Gettysburg. He commanded, as I mentioned, 2,500 cavalry. Now, cavalry in Civil War armies were the eyes of the army. They were the ones that went out in front. They were the ones, they had three roles, and I think I may have put them there, here. Three roles: to discover the enemy, to screen the movements of their own army, and probably most important is to select the battlefield on which the converging armies, remember these guys are just marching, along rows in columns of four, they could maybe make 15 to 20 miles a day, but men on horseback could ride out ahead, see the terrain, and determine where the enemy was, shield their own movements, and then most importantly, select the battlefield. So this particular monument stands on a place called McPherson's Ridge, where cavalry Union forces under John Buford first engage Confederate forces marching towards Gettysburg. And at the base of this monument, I'm trying to point it out, it says, with the inspiration of a cavalry officer, John Buford selected this battlefield. Many people would argue that John Buford's actions on June 30th, when he arrives in Gettysburg, set the Union up for victory on the 3 days of battle, July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd. Because of the inspiration, the ability of Buford to display what scholars call the coup d'oeil, and excuse me if you speak French. It's from Clausewitz, and he says, the secret to leadership is this ability to have a clear eye, to see. And this is what the quote is from Clausewitz. It says, when all is said and done, it is really the commander's coup d'oeil, his ability to see things simply, to identify at a glance the possibilities offered by the terrain, that is the essence of good leadership. To have a clear eye, to look over the battlefield, and to grasp instantly the picture of the ground and the situation, to relate one to the other, the local to the general. Basically, it's this ability of certain commanders to see the terrain clearly, the lay of the land. Buford was known for his ability to see good ground. These men, like Buford, who graduated in 1848 from West Point, took 2 years of drawing at West Point. Seems amazing. They've dropped that from the curriculum today. We've become so technologically dependent, even in our modern forces, that we're not training, in many cases, our leaders. The Marines do a much better job, and now the Army is starting to recapture this thing and to deliver us from this. I mean, how many of us can navigate now? Lori and I came up from Colorado, and we were pretty dependent on that GPS getting us through, up here. How many of us can navigate, today? Anyway, these guys were trained to draw. The first year, they learned portrait drawing, which is kind of interesting for future military officers in America at the time. The only academy really operating at the time was to teach people to draw faces. So the first year, they would take portrait drawing. And they had a very famous art instructor who was there for almost 30 or 40 years. I've forgotten his name, but who taught them how to paint portraits or draw portraits. In the second year, they took landscape drawing. And there are still some amazing paintings that Ulysses S. Grant, they're on display at West Point if you ever visited West Point, of these landscape drawings that look like a master artist had done. Either way, all the cadets took these 2 years of drawing, first portraits and then landscape, because they knew that leaders needed to be able to read the faces of those they led. And they needed to be able to read the terrain on which they fought if they were going to display this ability to identify at a glance the possibilities offered by the terrain. That is the essence of good leadership. To be able to perceive the advantages and disadvantages that terrain offers. They obviously didn't have drones like Seth had. Seth would have been a hero if he had had drones that could show the whole terrain. So the highest you could get maybe was to climb up into a cupola in a seminary or in a building, on top of a building, or get to the high ground, the physical high ground, or be on a horse. You can maybe see a little bit further than somebody walking on the ground, but it's this ability to read the terrain. There was a standard kind of saying that every leader in the Civil War on both North and South understood, is that topography is fate. Terrain is fate. You can't change the terrain. So regardless of what the terrain is, you had to figure out the advantages and disadvantages of that terrain, okay? So John Buford was one of the best at that. Unfortunately for the Union, he would die by December 1863. At his funeral at West Point, a guy by the name of John Pope, when he was talking about Buford's leadership, he reflects on this ability that Buford had. He said, Buford was known for his quickness of perception. Okay? Just like this Clausewitz says, this ability to see at a glance, this quickness of perception, and by his promptness of decision, having recognized the terrain, its advantages and disadvantages, and then making a decision based on that topography that's fate, that terrain that's destiny, that when he rides into Gettysburg. And then the third thing is on the gallantry on the battlefield. So I want to focus this morning primarily on this twin idea of quickness of perception and promptness of decision. There's a guy who wrote a book called Understanding Leadership. His name's Tom Marshall. And he says that this quality of foresight has these two ideas in it. This ability to see the future and to know what needs to be done. So I want you to think about that when we talk about this principle of leadership. This principle of foresight says a person is able to see the future and then know what needs to be done. Okay? So it goes along with what they said about Buford. He has this promptness of perception. He can view the terrain. He can see what Kozis and Posner called what's coming in front of them. Kozis and Posner in their book Leadership Challenge says leaders are the custodians of the future. Okay? When you give leadership in your businesses, in your family, you are a custodian as a leader of the future. The best leaders think beyond what's directly in front of them. They peer into the distance. They imagine what's over the horizon. And they move toward a new and compelling future. Okay? Leaders must possess foresight. This comes out in so many ways. Peter Drucker says leaders know the value of foresight. You can't predict the future, but you must assess and I always have trouble pronouncing this word, fortuity of present events. So you view the current terrain, the reality of which you face, and you're able, based on foresight, to know what needs to be done and what's coming over the horizon, what's coming towards you. Robert Greenleaf is famous for servant leadership, if you've read some of his stuff. A mark of leaders, an attribute that puts them in a position to show the way to others, is that they are better at most than pointing the direction to go. Foresight is the lead that the leader has. Once leaders lose this lead and events start to force their hand, they are leaders in name only. Okay. And Kozis and Posner in their book says the second most important characteristic in all leaders after integrity, after honesty, is their ability to be forward-looking. Okay? That's why John Buford, in many ways, not only displays that, but is an excellent example of this ability to perceive, to read the land and perceive what's coming. Now, I admit that this is a little bit of not the best map, but let me just set the situation before we watch a movie clip here in a minute. John Buford, fortunately for the Union, arrives in the little town of Gettysburg on June 30th. He immediately sends scouts in every direction. He knows that Confederate forces are massed west of Gettysburg and north of Gettysburg, which is kind of interesting because Southern forces are actually north of Union forces. But the Union, Lincoln had told the commanders of the Union Army, place yourself between the invading army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate forces, between Washington and that army. So Buford actually comes up this Emmitsburg Road, comes right up this road, goes right through there. It's hard to see this road into Gettysburg. And he moves through the little town of Gettysburg and goes out to some ridges west of town. Okay? And from there, he sends out scouts in every direction. Okay? Because Confederate forces are coming from the north, and they're coming from the west. When Buford rides up this, trained with this stroke of the eye, this ability to perceive the advantages and disadvantages, he notices that the terrain is made up of a series of north-south running ridges, okay? So we have a ridge over here, it's called Hare Ridge, it's hard to see. Then we have a McPherson's Ridge here, and then we have Seminary Ridge, and then we have the Cemetery Ridge. And what's interesting about the Cemetery Ridge is this ridge stops right south of the town of Gettysburg. And there's a little hill called Cemetery Hill right there. Buford sees Cemetery Hill and this ridge that connects Little Round Top, very famous place on the battlefield, Little Round Top to Cemetery Hill, and some other hills off to the right, which are Culp's Hill, which you see right here, as a perfect defensive position for Union forces, okay? So he recognizes that at the end of the day, once the armies begin to clash, Union forces need to hold particularly Cemetery Hill right here and the ridge that runs south and the connecting ridge to Culp's Hill. So Buford sees that on June 30th, okay? The rest of the, it's only 25 to 2,900 cavalry have ridden into town. And it just so happens Confederate forces are massed. 20,000 men are massed about 8 miles out in this direction, and another 20,000 Confederates are massed north of it about 14 miles. And all of them, on the morning of July 1st, are going to move towards the town of Gettysburg, okay? Buford only has 2,500 men. He's going to be facing, on the morning of July 1st, he is going to be facing a combined Confederate forces of 40,000 men coming. Fortunately, his good friend, a guy by the name of John Reynolds, is only 8 miles down this road, this Emmitsburg Road, in just on the border between Maryland. And when Buford arrives and he sees the terrain, he recognizes the advantages of the high ground south and east of the town of Gettysburg. He makes a decision based on what he sees coming, that if the Union forces are going to win the battle here, they need to hold the high ground south and east of town. So Buford, and we'll see this in the movie clip in just a minute, makes a decision, okay? Based on seeing the future. Like he's there on June 30th, he sees the terrain, he sees the topography that is fate, of fate. He can't change the topography, but he can make a decision so that Union forces would hold that special hill there, stuck out like a sore thumb, they said. 5 months later, after the battle, greatest president in the United States, Abraham Lincoln, would come to honor the men who fought, and he would give the Gettysburg Address right there on Cemetery Hill, the center of the high ground that was the critical high ground during the Battle of Gettysburg. But because of the decisions that Buford made with the inspiration of a cavalry officer to hold the high ground, or to set up Union forces to hold the high ground south and east of town, every scholar of the Civil War says it was that decision on June 30th that determined the Union victory. That's how critical foresight is. That's how critical foresight is in your business and in my ministry and your lives, in your families, is this ability to be able to develop this ability to see what's coming. Now, before I show you the clip, I want to introduce this particular diagram has probably had more influence on my leadership journey than any other diagram. This is a shortened version of what they call a sigmoid curve or an S curve. I'm going to leave, by the way, all of these slides and everything for folks here at the church, and I'm sure you guys could post them somewhere if folks want to get this if I'm going a little too quickly. But an S-curve within has a lot of applications. If you think about things start out with a certain, I'm going to just draw the S-curve here. Things start out with a certain momentum, and then there's a lot of good momentum, and then I like to think of in terms of motivation, and then the motivation begins to waver, and then it begins to go the other direction. I mean, a lot of people use it within the agricultural world. We're in spring, things start to happen, we have the summer kind of period, and then fall, and things begin to, and then we're into a winter cycle or something. Many folks see it as part of explaining the complex social phenomena, how people change and how organizations change. I like to think about it as whatever whatever situation is I'm in, I have to do two things. I have to, like Buford on June 30th, I have to understand where I am on this S-curve. Let's just say this S-curve. So Buford arrives, let's say, on the timeline of this rapid movements, these, before the armies get there, and then, the battle happens, and then the armies are going another direction or something. This beginning, middle, end is basically, somewhere along the line, we have to confront the terrain of the situation we're facing. So think about your business, think about your farm or wherever you serve, the business that you lead, is that you're somewhere along this momentum S-curve, okay? So that is what, the Koza Symposium says, after Foresight, the one thing that the leader needs is to challenge the status quo. Status quo is just Latin for what is. This is the existence. This is what we're facing in our organization, in our team, in our family, in our situation. This is what is. And foresight begins when I first observe the terrain, the topography of what is. So I begin to understand the situation in which I am. Buford realizes on June 30th, I only have 2,500 men. I have 10,000 men, not too far. They might be able to get here at around 10 o'clock. But what am I going to do between 5 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock before that first Union infantry? And so he's faced, when he recognizes the reality of what he's facing at that status quo, he makes a decision. And what's beautiful about this clip, as I'm going to show you, is this fits in with this S-curve idea that the best leaders are able to not only recognize what is, but to also imagine two alternative futures. Those two alternative futures, the first one is the probable future, okay? In other words, the question we ask, wherever we are on this S-curve, in our organization, in our family, in our team, wherever we are, in the school year, that sort of thing, is where are we? What is the status quo? What's the reality of the situation that we're in, okay? And then the genius of foresight comes when we can imagine two futures. The first future is the probable future. In other words, that's what will happen if nothing changes. In other words, if we just watch what's going on, we ride the momentum of the S-curve, the probable future will be the result. The genius of leadership is, however, is that not just to sit and observe the momentum, but having seen the status quo, you understand what will be, but you ask the question, what could be? What could be? And that's your preferred future. the thing that doesn't exist right now that could possibly exist. And so you ask the question about this, what could be? Okay? So you have, the first question is discerning the terrain, discerning the reality of what is, just like Buford. He realizes, I've got 2,500 men, I've got 40,000 moving in this direction. The high ground, the critical high ground that I need the Union forces on is about, a mile back from me. And if we don't hold the high ground, if I don't do something on the morning of July 1st, the probable future will be Confederate forces will get here before Union forces, and they will hold the high ground. They will hold the high ground. And having lost two times to Robert E. Lee over the course of the last 6 to 8 months, if Robert E. Lee and the Southern forces win a major victory in the North, the Copperhead movement at that time, called the peace movement, would sue for peace. We're just going to let the South go, and America would be a completely different place. Because not only would we have the North and the South, but just from learning political sciences, two states are can never achieve balance, so you need a third. So we would have had from the Pacific, from the Atlantic to Pacific, we would have probably had 3 nations: a northern nation, a southern nation, and a western nation. And that could have been the result had John Buford not tried to move towards a preferred future. So the preferred future then, obviously, would be for the Union forces to hold the high ground south and east of town for them. So what's he going to do? The high ground is back behind him, and I'm just going to go back to the map. I'm getting more excited about this little scenario here. I'll try this map this time. Okay, the high ground is right here. Buford is originally placed here on June 30th, up on Seminary Ridge and McPherson's Ridge. 20,000 Confederate forces under a guy by the name of Henry Heth, who was actually his classmate at West Point, so they knew each other. Henry Heth is coming from this direction, and a guy by the name of Dick Ewell in command of the Confederate Second Corps, not important, Southern forces are coming from the north. Buford says, well, I've got 10,000 men coming under my friend John Reynolds, so what am I going to do? He has 2,500 cavalry, and he makes the decision to move towards this preferred future. And that decision is to send out his cavalry forces down this road where these 20,000 men were going to be first arriving at Gettysburg, and to fight them dismounted. That monument that I showed you of Buford is a very interesting monument for a cavalry commander, because he's standing on the ground and he's holding binoculars. And it's a reference to what he had learned out west, fighting Native Americans, that these grand cavalry charges, ours is not the reason why, ours is but to do or die, so rode the 500 into the valley of death. That grand charge was not an effective way to use cavalry. So Buford recognizes that these north-south running ridges, he could send his cavalry out. They had some advanced rifles, these Sharps rifles that could fire 7 times a minute. The infantry, the Confederate infantry had the normal muzzle-loading rifles that could fire at best 3 times a minute. So Buford sends his cavalry out dismounted. Well, he sends them out in groups of 4. One person would hold the 4 horses. 3 men with their Sharps rifles would come up over a ridge, dispersed, and then they would fire at the approaching Confederate forces. Okay? And then they would move a little bit and fire. And, they created a perception in the mind of Confederate forces that they were facing infantry and not cavalry. It's a very clever tactic. And so what Buford is trying to do is to force the Confederate infantry that's, let's say, this is the road from Cashtown that, marching shoulder to shoulder, Confederate forces on the only kind of halfway paved road. So if you're going to move 20,000 men, you've got to move them in column. So they're marching basically in groups of 4 in a long, long line, okay? Miles, 20,000 men right behind each other in columns of 4. But Napoleonic tactics at that time says you can't fight in a column, you have to fight in a line. Because all Buford would have to do is put cannons down on that road and just start lobbing artillery right down the road. If you miss the first rank, you hit the second rank, the third rank. And so Napoleonic tactics tell you whenever you're approaching the enemy, you move from column into line. So Buford understood that, obviously. And so what he wants to do is he wants to force, am I going too much into the detail of this day? I get a little bit excited, but anyway, you force the column into line. And when you force them into line, what happens? You've got trees, you've got farmhouses, you've got fences that you slow them down. And Buford is able to slow them down. The first shot is fired at 7:30 in the morning by one of Buford's men, about 3 miles in the direction towards Cashtown. And they do not get that 3 miles until about 10 to 10:30 before they're here on this McPherson's Ridge. He trades terrain. He knew he couldn't stop them forever because all they did was deploy into line, and all of a sudden they realized, hey, there's only 7 guys up there, or 15 guys, and we got 20,000 coming in this direction. And so eventually they fall back from ridge to ridge and ridge. It takes them about 3 hours or so to get back, and by that time Union forces under John Reynolds had begun to arrive and throws back the initial wave of Confederate forces. And behind John Reynolds, other people arrive. So the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg takes place west and north of town. The battle that was sort of a meeting engagement because the Confederate forces did not have eyes. Their cavalry was not there. They didn't know what they were facing. There's a famous line from one of Robert E. Lee's men as they're approaching Gettysburg, and Jeb Stuart, who was the cavalry commander, in other words, the equivalent of John Buford on the other side, on the Confederate side, is out basically on a joyride. He'd been embarrassed at a place called Brandy Station, and he wants to win fame again, and he leaves the army with its best, leaves the cavalry, the Confederate cavalry with its best men, is on a joyride, okay? Jeb Stuart was a great cavalry commander, but this particular day, he was disconnected. And Robert E. Lee would write in the after report, in the operational report, it says, "I was blind in enemy territory. I did not know what was in front of me." And then he would write, "The army was much embarrassed by the absence of its cavalry." And then one of Robert E. Lee's key leaders said, "An army without cavalry in a strange and hostile country is as a man deprived of his eyesight. He may be ever brave and strong, but he cannot intelligently administer a single effective blow." Robert E. Lee was in an army that didn't have foresight. Buford had it. He's able to delay Confederate forces, and because of that, they sacrifice west of town and north of town, that by the evening of July 1st, Union forces are now in possession of the high ground. And in Napoleonic warfare, the high ground gives you all the advantages. It gives you the advantages of Visibility. It gives you the advantages of gravity. Your artillery will fire further. Your men can charge down a hill much easier than they can charge up a hill. And you get this sense, I don't know, you ever play King of the Mountain when you were growing up, you know. You always feel good when you're on the top of the mountain. And Sun Tzu, many years before Christ, says, if an army is on the high ground, you just better pass him by, because he has all the advantages. Buford sets this up during those days. And the way he does it, and this is why I want to show this clip, is to see how Buford sees what is and then imagines these two alternative futures. So as we watch this clip of Buford showing up on June 30th, gathering his men around him, just look for this, because if there's anything that I can help, that has helped me, and I can maybe encourage you in your own leadership, is to think through these three questions. What is the current reality? What is the status quo? And then what will be if I do nothing? But then ask the question, what could be? What could I do that would affect the future? And that decision is at the heart of what leadership is. It's moving us towards this preferred future. Okay? So let's watch this clip, and I think Eli and the folks back there have got this figured out. Hopefully you saw within the clip, or you could pick up how important it is on our ability to see not only the terrain, the lay of the land, what's true of my reality at this particular moment in the momentum S-curve of my organization or family, or where I'm giving leadership, or in church leadership, whatever the environment is. This ability to see the ground, but also this ability to see these two futures. And Buford does a great job, or the clip captures this idea, of leadership happens when we can imagine two alternative futures. One is the probable future of what will be if you and I don't do anything, okay, as leaders in our positions. But if we can dare to ask the question, what could be? If we could dare to think about a preferred future at the end of the day, at the end of the year, at the end of our life, at the end of our ministry, what would be the preferred future? And then we have the boldness and courage to then make a decision to adjust things towards that preferred future. And when you make that little change, or that change towards a preferred future, it's much easier when you're riding the momentum of the organizations. This is the power of the S-curve. I've been involved with a lot of organizations that knew they needed to change. They recognized the reality of what is, but they just hoped it would change. And then they would get up here and they're starting to level off in their production of whatever they're producing, or the morale of the organization, whatever it might be. And it begins to level off, and then all of a sudden, oh my goodness, we need to make changes. And when you start, it's much harder to make a change when you're at the top of that S-curve and it's going in the other direction. So the earlier we can make changes in the momentum is much easier than if we wait. And what makes leaders, this ability to foresight, this leaders lead, is this ability to make decisions, to make those adjustments and move towards that preferred future. And I keep telling myself, whenever I face a situation or stuff, decide earlier. How can I decide earlier to begin to move towards this preferred future, rather than just hoping everything would turn out? And when we do that, we can move towards this preferred future. Now, let me just make the point. This movement towards this preferred future is actually just another beginning of an S-curve, because there's another S-curve that begins there. And so leadership is always adjusting towards that preferred future. Now, let me just comment on a couple of these three questions. What is, what will be, what could be. Leaders should always ask, what is. In whatever situation you're confronting, in whatever your leadership arena is, you ask what is. You embrace reality. A friend of mine, and this and I may have left it on the slide, I've forgotten. Oh yeah. Reality is my friend. You know, some of us, if we have responsibility for leadership, and when we observe reality, it doesn't look so good. And, you know, we put on blinders to what's actually happening in our life, in our organization, in our family. We close our eyes to that. But if we would understand and embrace reality is my friend, regardless of what it says about me as a leader or about how I've led up to this point, as soon as we say, this, though I do not like what I'm seeing right now, in the current reality, in the status quo, in the topography that I'm facing, in the terrain that I'm facing, if I can say, reality is my friend, I embrace it. It almost always gives you a direction to go. It always drives you towards this preferred future. Reality is your friend. But in order to understand, ask what is, you and I need to gather as much information about our current reality. You know, Buford sent out scouts in every direction. They gave him information. Whenever cavalry or even infantry units approached a new location, the first place they went before they got to a new location were in the high schools, because the high schools had maps, and they needed a map to begin to get an understanding of the terrain that they would see with their eyes. Okay? They needed a map. And so you and I have to build a map, in a sense, of our current reality. So we map reality. One of the interesting things of looking at Civil War battlefields or Civil War warfare is this dependence upon maps. The maps are not reality, but they do give us a picture of maps. And that's why these guys would learn, to landscape drawing, is it gives them a sense to see what they could see and then compare it to the map and begin to get a grasp of the reality that they're facing. So very important to map reality. And one of the things in our digital age that, we tend to see things in a 8.5 by 11. We outline, you guys probably teach outlining in school. One of the things that is really pretty fascinating is when you take a piece of paper and you turn it to this direction, to landscape, it forces you to think differently than if you do this linear, logical way. So whenever I have a chance and I'm facing current reality, I'll get a big whiteboard and that's, 16 by 9 or whatever, and that's not in a linear formation, because we're trained in Western education to think linearly, when we need to, grab a hold of our ability to see the right brain, the ability to see images more clearly. And by just turning a sheet of paper and out, drawing it gives you this, it just leads you to a better understanding of the lay of the land, in other words, the terrain. So let me encourage you to think through that. Okay, one of the realities of looking at our current reality that we're facing And embracing it as a friend is when we look at it, it doesn't look so good. And Peter Senge says this great quote, ego and esteem always intertwine with our ability to lead. There is always the tendency to put a positive spin on everything imaginable while ignoring the evidence to the contrary. We easily lose sight of what is really happening, Peter Senge. Okay, we have to watch our ego when we're looking at the current reality that we're facing, because our ego always gets in the way, because it reflects on us as leaders if the current situation is not so good. So we have to be aware of that. And this is a monument from Gettysburg to the soldiers that fought from Vermont. The guy on top of this is George Stannard. And he was upset that he didn't win the Medal of Honor. So when they put a monument up to him, he'd wanted a monument with him way at the top of it, just overlooking the battlefield. This is the problem with so much of our lives, is we're so driven by ego and what people will think, or even what we, in our own self-awareness, are seeing in our own lives or in the lives of our organization. And so we have to see reality as our friend. It's the truth we're after. It's the truth in our character. It's the truth in our organizations that really enable us to change. So we have to always beware and watch our ego. Okay. Lincoln has this great quote. He said, "Leaders must make the horror concrete. Only then will people be able to break it apart." So in our organizations, in our lives, if we can make the horror concrete, in other words, we can really see it, then we can break it apart. God can break it apart. Our team can break it apart. But if we always try to hide the reality, Robert E. Lee on July 2nd got a number of battle reports from his men. Okay? This is on the second day of the battle. He got these after-action reports. Let me see if I can find the quote. On the night of July 2nd, prior to the devastation of Pickett's charge on July 3rd, Lee collects reports from his senior commanders. After Buford had delayed them for a couple hours, on the first day of the battle, Confederate forces take all the terrain west of town, all the terrain north of town, all the terrain east of town, but they didn't get the high ground. But they won a victory, basically, if you talk about terrain, capturing terrain on July 1st. And on July 2nd, they also take additional terrain, Lower Culp's Hill, Devil's Den, Peach Orchard, some famous places on Gettysburg. They take more. And so Robert E. Lee gets from his commanders a series of battlefield reports. And the conclusion of someone who had read these reports said, "This is true of leadership. We always exaggerate the damage done to the enemy and underplay the damage done to us." So these reports, because we're driven by ego and self-esteem, we tend to view, we over-exaggerate the damage we've done to the enemy and under-exaggerate the damage that they've done to us. So we have to get clear reports. And on the basis of those reports, Robert E. Lee decides to do the massive Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble charge across that open field. One of the last grand infantry charges in history, because it was so devastating. 12,500 move across that field, only 6,000 return from that field. And the battle is lost on July 3rd based on the fact that his commanders didn't give him an accurate accounting because they were driven by their ego and self-esteem. So our ego and self-esteem always get in the way of our ability to lead. So if we can somehow be able to embrace reality as our friend. Now, of course, reality can't be our only friend. We need another friend, and that friend is this preferred future. And so one of this vision of what could be if I make a decision to move my team, my organization, my church, my ministry, my business, my family towards this preferred future. And we make that decision. So we recognize what is, and then we have to make a decision. So we confront, in other words, we confront the brutal facts of the current reality, and then we act on the implications, okay? So we move that, but there's always, decision-making is really hard. And part of the reason of decision-making is so hard, and this is where battlefield leadership has really helped me. Colin Powell, famous American general, recently passed away a number of years ago. He says, all decisions within warfare are made between 40% certainty and 70% certainty. So between 40 and 70, if you're on a scale of 100. So no military commander in the fog of war, in the uncertainty of war, can make a decision with 75% certainty or 80% certainty or 90% certainty. The problem in our leadership is that we would really love, before we make a decision, to delay Confederate forces west of town. I mean, was Buford 100% sure it would work? He had no idea it would absolutely work. There were too many variables. So we can never look for certainty in warfare, because we see, as Clausewitz says, through the fog. Men look like trees walking. So we don't know whether they're trees or men that are marching along this road. It's like early in the morning when you can't see very clearly, or late at night when it's getting dark. In warfare, in life, that's the environment in which we have to make decisions. So we would love to have perfect clarity, of vision. We would like to have 100% certainty, but we can never have it. So we have to recognize, if I'm going to make a decision, I can't wait until I'm 100% sure or 90% sure. Sometimes we just have to make it. So Andy Stanley, in his book on vision, says, all of us as leaders have a certain percentage in our mind in which we feel comfortable making a decision. So if we're facing a major course change or a new business direction or something, we have just naturally, there's I would easily make this decision if it were 90% or 80% sure. The trouble is, if we wait for that, we don't make the decision early enough to take advantages of the momentum. So Andy Stanley says, just do a mental trick. Just says, I would make this decision if I were this percent sure that it would lead towards this preferred future. Andy Stanley says, and just reduce that by 10% and see if you'd make the decision then, or 20%. And he says, that will help you move towards that preferred future and take advantage of the terrain rather than just waiting and hoping that things would change. Leaders primarily are decision makers. They have this quickness of perception, as Buford had, and this promptness of decision. Okay? So when you think about it, am I making this decision based on an unrealistic percentage of certainty? Because you can never be. It's one of the lessons of battlefield leadership. No leader, as Colin Powell says, all military decisions are made between 40 and 70%. D-Day invasion, you can see Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's got his fingers crossed. He hopes this will work. There's no way he's sure that it's going to work. Okay? Every great decision is made never on this assumption of certainty. So we always operate in uncertainty. Okay. So leaders imagine two futures, the probable and the preferred, and I'm going to make let me just say this, and then I'm going to make one other point. All right, I want you just for a moment to consider a challenge that you're facing in your leadership arena or in your personal life. Consider just that challenge. Just mentally, what's one challenge that you're facing in your leadership arena or your personal life, okay? Okay? Do you have something in mind? Okay. Now ask the question, what's the probable future if nothing is done? In this challenge, try to imagine what will be if we just ride the momentum curve. Okay? And then ask the question, and this is the critical third question, what can I do to challenge the status quo and move towards this preferred future? What decision should I make, okay, to move towards that preferred future? And just this very last point is the followers' greatest frustration in the leader is indecision. Okay? All of us have been in organizations. We said, I know a decision should be made, and the leader is not willing to make the decision. This guy is a guy by the name of Dick Ewell. He was a Confederate Corps commander that's coming in from the north. Right at the critical moment on the Battle of July 1st, Robert E. Lee says, take the high ground if practicable. And Dick Ewell, when people talk about Confederate losses at Gettysburg, they point their finger at this guy right here. And he himself would admit, a lot of mistakes were made at Gettysburg. I made most of them. After the battle, Lee would pull Dick Ewell aside and speak to him about his want of decision. Okay? So the leader's greatest frustration in you as you give leadership is this want of decision, this inability. And I'll end with this slide right here. Teddy Roosevelt says, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing you can do is the wrong thing. The worst thing you can do is to do nothing. Okay? The worst thing you can do is to do nothing. Okay. So let me encourage you to practice foresight, embrace reality as a friend, imagine these two futures, what will be, that probable future, but then dare to dream of a preferred future. Dare to dream of a preferred future. There's probably the second greatest speech in American history is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, 100 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. He begins almost in the same way that Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And the whole night before, Martin Luther King's aides are telling him, you got to be hard on America. You've got to paint a picture of reality in America in regards to ethnic division or racial division in America. And before Martin Luther gave his speech, his favorite gospel singer, a gal by the name of Mahalia Jackson, sings the song, How We Got Over, referring to Israel's redemption out of Egypt. It's a great, beautiful gospel song. You can find it on Spotify, How We Got Over. And so Mahalia Jackson sings that. There's something else in the agenda or in the program. And then Martin Luther stands up and he begins what would be the I Have a Dream speech. But the problem is, for the first 7 minutes, he is painting a picture of reality in America, and it's very depressing, and it's beautifully done. But Mahalia Jackson, who had this beautiful gospel foresight, she recognizes that Martin Luther King is losing the audience. And she had heard Martin Luther King go through a series of riffs about little black boys and little black girls joining hands, sitting down at a table of fellowship, these beautiful images And Mahalia Jackson, Martin Luther King is on the dais, and Mahalia Jackson, and you can see this in photos, Mahalia Jackson turns to Martin Luther King, who's up there, who's losing the audience because he's stuck in the status quo and the probable future in America. And she yells at him, Martin, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream. And Martin Luther King, you can see it at the 7-minute point, he takes his prepared notes, sets them aside. He says, I have a dream of what America could be in the future. And that's why we remember it. You don't remember the first 7 minutes. You remember those riffs that he had done before. And for some reason, his aides had convinced him, just hammer America. And Mahalia Jackson, gospel singer, says, no. We live in light of hope. Napoleon says, we are as leaders are purveyors of hope. And he says, tell them about the dream. And so, as you and I lead, we face the current reality, and it might be bad. We see where it's headed, but we always cast a vision towards a preferred future. Okay? Hopefully that's helpful. Seth, you want to close, or are we done? Just wrap her up, or what? You got any comments?
Appreciate that. So if you sign up for the steak fry, that's tonight, 5:30, men only. If you want to hear more from Jay will be here also for church tomorrow morning. Not doing the same thing, not talking about Foresight. He'll be talking about identity, the high ground, right, of leadership and how that relates to the scripture. And it's wonderful. So we invite you back for that if you'd like to come. That'll be tomorrow, both of our services. But other thing I could say, if you're interested in going to Gettysburg, Jay is not going currently, but Jay has passed his ministry on to a team, and they're going to be taking people on a leadership journey on the battlefield. So if that would ever interest you, Gary Schmaltz, who is the head of that, or one of the heads of it, he lives in Minneapolis, and he's going to be with us, I think, at the steak fry this evening. So you could find out more about that, or I'm sure Jay would love to tell you that. So thanks so much for being here. Jay, are you going to be around if people want to talk to you? Yep. But have a great rest of your day.